What's up, everybody? So again, I'm back with a video on Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, specifically pages 8 through 11, okay? So in the last video, I covered the start of chapter 2, and now we're going to be diving a bit more into detail. So let's start out by just brief recap. In the previous video, I discussed 3 arguments that MacIntyre gives, 3 sets of arguments, along with some of my own examples. And the main reason that these were articulated was to demonstrate that they are incommensurable. So remember, the abortion advocate versus the pro-life advocate are going to be arguing about and putting forth logically valid arguments on each side, but their assumptions and their premises with which they're operating with are going to be radically incommensurable. So the pro-choice activist and the pro-choice activist is not going to agree with the pro-life activist's conception of freedom, their conception of the person, etc. The pro-life activist is not going to agree with the pro-choice's ranking of bodily autonomy over human rights, etc., etc. And remember, I gave examples in environmentalism and also with the COVID lockdowns. So let's talk more about these arguments here. So if you turn to page 8 in the text, we're going to see MacIntyre putting forth 3 characteristics of these arguments. So let's run through these and let's kind of go in depth, try to figure out and parse out what this all means. So top of page 8, he's going to say the first of these 3 kinds of characteristics is going to be the conceptual incommensurability of the rival arguments in each of these 3 debates. Every one of these arguments is logically valid, as I pointed out, but, as he says, the rival premises are such that we possess no rational way of weighing the claims of one as against another. For each premise employs some quite different normative or evaluative concept from the others, so that the claims made upon us are of quite different kinds. In the first argument, for example, premises which invoke justice and innocence are at odds with premises which invoke success and survival. In the second, i.e. the ones about abortion, premises which invoke rights are at odds with those which invoke universalizability. In the third, it is the claim of equality that is matched against that of liberty. Remember, that was claims about competing notions of distributive justice. It is precisely, MacIntyre says, because there is in our society no established way of deciding between these claims that moral argument appears to be necessarily interminable. From our rival conclusions, we can argue back to rival premises, but when we do arrive at our premises, argument ceases and the invocation of one premise against another becomes a matter of pure assertion and counter-assertion. Hence the shrill tone of moral debate. I think that MacIntyre really articulates this passage in a powerful, clear, and concise manner, so I won't articulate on what he said there. I explained it in the previous video. This, I think, is something that you can pause the video, rewind it if need be, go back to the text, and just dwell on. And again, think up your own examples. But this incommensurability between premises, again, that's going to be the first characteristic of these arguments. Let's move on to the second and third because they're brand new here. And I'm going to do a little bit of reading of the text here. So he's going to also mention, before moving on to those second and thirds, this is important. It's kind of a subtlety that you don't want to miss out on. He's going to mention that this shrillness, as we mentioned, this shrillness in moral debate, it seems to have an additional source. And it seems to have a source in us. Okay, so what does he mean here? Again, this is the bottom-ish of page 8 here. He's going to say, for whenever an agent, i.e. us, enters the form of public debate, he or she has already presumably, explicitly or implicitly, settled the matter in question in his or her own mind. So if I'm a pro-life activist or a pro-choice activist or an environmental conservationist or an environmental exploitationist, if you want to use that term, if it's a real term, I guess, we've already said, look at these criterion that we've used in our argument, that already appeals to us. Now let's think this through again with this example of abortion. if I'm a pro-choice activist here and I'm putting forth this logically valid argument, yet I put forth that argument, okay, to the pro-life activist and she doesn't accept it, well, this should give us pause here. This should give us pause because what it means is that my argument as the pro-choice activist doesn't actually meet the criterion or the criteria of rationality insofar as it can't convince all other people. Why is that? Again, it's because of these competing premises. Well, this is quite interesting because if my argument can't actually convince other people and only convince or back up the people in my own group, my own pro-choice group, but it can't actually reach out and convert the pro-life people, well, if my argument can't do that, then it doesn't seem that I have any criteria for actually holding that. Let's rephrase this in a more abstract way. Let's say this. If I can't decide between my conception of the human person and the pro-lifers' conception of the human person, if I can't put forth a rational criterion for deciding objectively, meaning outside of the two activists, if I can't put forth a criterion for deciding which one is correct, which conception is correct, again, which conception of freedom is correct, in the environmentalist debate, which conception of environmentalism and the human's role in the environment is correct, if I can't put forth criteria for deciding which one of these competing premises, competing assumptions is correct, well, what does that mean? It means that I don't actually have a criterion for doing that. It means that I actually haven't decided based on a rational basis which one of these competing assumptions and premises are correct. It means that I've just taken it for granted. I've just assumed or taken that based upon some cultural phenomenon or my intuitions. I've just taken up those positions based on those things, on my epistemic priors, as they call them in philosophy. So if I'm a pro-life activist and I can't put forth a competing, or I can't put forth some sort of standard which privileges my definition of the person over the pro-choicer's definition of a person, well, then it seems that I've just inherited that definition from my epistemic priors, my cultural phenomena, my religious phenomena, all of these things that I've encountered. And what that means is that my argument is actually based on arbitrary factors. It doesn't actually have rationality, or it actually isn't it isn't all that rational. That's going to be a related point to number one here, something that I think is very, very worth dwelling on. Again, go back, read the text. Please read the text, very important. So let's move on to 2 and 3 here. So he says here at the bottom of page 8, a second equally important but contrasting characteristic of these arguments is that they do nonetheless purport to be impersonal rational arguments, and as such are usually presented in a mode appropriate to that impersonality. All he means by this is these arguments for environmental conservatism or environmental exploitation, they present themselves as being rational. But as we've seen, underlying those arguments is a faux rationality. It's fake. That's something worth dwelling. That's something really, really should shock people. I mean, when you hear Tucker Carlson on Fox News, or Anderson Cooper on CNN, or Don Lemon, when you hear these people putting forth these arguments, you should think, well, this isn't rational. At the bottom, it's not. At the bottom, it's their epistemic priors, their, as we shall see, emotions, their arbitrary feelings, really informing which premises they find acceptable to begin with, which they then use to formulate their purported rational arguments. That's what's going on here. That's MacIntyre's point. So he's going to continue on here, and he's going to say, consider 2 different ways in which I may provide backing for an injunction to someone else to perform specific actions. And he's going to say, well, you can say, do so-and-so like a military commander. And this is going to be, you're going to do some sort of action based upon the status, the social context with which you're in. The other way somebody is going to give you a command and you're going to do it is going to be based upon some sort of impersonal criteria here. So for instance, Kant, he's going to articulate a duty-driven concept of rights and morality here. And he's going to say, you should do this because reason demands it. It's your duty to do it. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, these people are going to advance utilitarian theories. They're going to say, look, you should do this, you should do X, Y, and Z because it increases your utility. Contemporary economists are going to be saying the same stuff. You should buy that car because it increases your utility, etc., etc. We can think about all these examples here. But again, MacIntyre is going to say the particular link between the context of utterance, meaning the context with which some person is giving you a command, and the force of the reason giving, which always holds in the case of expressions of personal preferences or desire, is severed in the case of moral and other evaluative utterances. So this is supposedly it is, supposedly. Now, this is wrong, because we've demonstrated that our moral utterances, they're not impersonal. They're not these impersonal criterion that such as Kant, such as utilitarianism. There actually is, in our moral utterances, in our moral arguments, there actually is a context of arbitrary willing, arbitrary emotion, arbitrary choosing between rival conceptions of competing goods. So this impersonal criterion is actually, it seems to provide a contradiction here for us. And now, if we take a look at my notes here, I've pointed this out. And so let me sum up what I said, because it gets a little dense here. So again, there's going to be this second criterion, or second characteristic of these arguments is going to be this purported impersonal rationality. And we have in commands, we have, say, for instance, you're in the military. These are going to be personal context-driven commands. Somebody's going to tell you to do X. Or when you're doing some sort of ethical behavior, for instance, you're carrying out some sort of Kantian demand, it's going to be an impersonal justification, or impersonal. It's going to claim to be not appeal to context. But this is paradoxical, because moral utterances, as we've seen in the previous video, collapse into disagreement. But the use of such moral utterances and moral expressions in our languages acts as if there is an appeal to objective standards, objective impersonal standards. And this is crucial. Let me rephrase this. Our moral disagreements, our moral arguments about abortion, about just war theory, about distributive justice, about reparations, about giving land back, etc., all these ethical things, we have seen that they're context-driven and appeal to some sort of arbitrary emotional standard at the basis, some sort of arbitrary choosing and privileging of competing rival premises and goods, competing rival assumptions as well. So we've seen that they're context-driven, like very similar to a military commander saying, listen, you're going to do X, Y, Z because I'm your commander, that's it. Or a parent saying, you're going to do this because X, Y, Z, because I'm your parent. Based on that context, there's that context going on there. So our moral utterances, our ethical disagreements here are based on context, and they're based on an arbitrary willing and choice, but they purport to be completely rational and completely independent of any sort of subjective standards here. Why, you should ask, why are our moral disagreements, our ethical arguments, why are they purporting to be something they're not? They're wearing a mask. Why are they doing that? Let's move on in the text and see what MacIntyre has to say here. So he's going to say near the bottom of page 9 here, does not this suggest that the practice of moral argument in our culture expresses at least an aspiration to be or to become rational in this area of our lives? Yes, there is this aspiration to become rational. So then we're going to look here at the third characteristic, and that's going to be that contemporary moral debate is related, or it's been severed from its historical context here. So why don't you take a look at my notes here? I kind of spell this out a little bit more. So I'm going to say each of the conceptions of moral claims we invoke has a historical character to it. So for instance, Marx, Rawls, they're going to put forth these arguments which have a historical character, or they're embedded in their historical system, in their historical context. So Marx, for instance, is going to be reacting against what he sees as a very exploitative, nasty, brutish capitalism. And he's going to build his system, his economic system, his political system, philosophical system, his ethics. He's going to build that off of this historical phenomenon he sees in the world at his point in time. Again, Rawls is going to do a very similar thing. Thomas Aquinas, that's a very easy one to articulate here. He's going to be operating within a theological system and also an Aristotelian system. So he's going to be taking Aristotle's conception of a telos, or a final end, and he's going to be applying that to his natural law ethics. And he's going to be saying, look, you have virtues, you have a telos, you have essences, and it is the human's telos to fulfill that essence. He or she is going to use these virtues as dispositions to achieve that telos, and eventually that telos is going to end up with the supreme good, which is God. So you can't divorce Aquinas' ethics from this context. You can't just say, look at fortitude. What a great virtue. Wow, we can just apply this wherever we want. No, you can't do that, because it functions and it has as a specific virtue within Aquinas' system, and it has this entire metaphysical package that comes with it. So that's what MacIntyre is going to point out here, and this point about the history is going to play a bigger role as we move on in the book here. So the point with that is simply that these concepts, these moral concepts, and these moral arguments have been divorced from their cultural and philosophical context. And he's going to quote, and he's going to say something quite interesting too. He's going to say, there seems to be a possible relationship between the history of moral discourse and the history of academic curriculum. By that he simply means that we treat ethics as a continuing debate and divorce the thinkers from their historical and cultural context. So, with that in mind, I think it's good to kind of do a little bit of a recap and maybe end the video within a minute or two, just because I've thrown a lot at you here. So MacIntyre is going to put forth these characteristics which we've discussed, and he's going to ultimately say here on page 11, moreover, if the characteristics of our own moral arguments which I have identified, most notably the fact that we simultaneously and inconsistently treat moral arguments as an exercise of our rational powers and as mere expressive assertion, are symptoms of moral disorder, we ought to be able to construct a true historical narrative in which at an earlier stage moral argument is very different in kind. Can we? Now, he's going to be, in the next video, I'm going to discuss this. I'm going to start off there, and I'm going to discuss some objections to that, such as nihilism, and then we're going to move on and talk about emotivism. But let's just really recap really quick the things that we talked about, because I want you to really get these down and start thinking about this in your own life. So remember, we have this conceptual incommensurability in our arguments. Again, go back and watch the previous video for more detail on that. We also have a purported impersonal rationality. So our arguments purport to be impersonal, and rational. They purport to be these objective standards. Oh, I am putting forth the knockdown, logically valid argument over X issue, over social justice, distributive justice, over reparations, over abortion. This should convince anybody. Actually, as we've seen, no, this is not the case. At the very bottom of these are this sort of arbitrary, emotion-driven acceptance of premises and competing goods. And by competing good, I simply mean whatever you define as a good. So for instance, the pro-choice activist is going to take as a good the value of freedom and bodily autonomy, whereas a competing good is going to be the pro-lifers' definition, you could say, of the fetus, or the definition of a human person, definition of human rights. And they're going to take that competing good and they're going to rank that higher and define it differently than other people. So that's what I mean by competing good. So this is paradoxical because our arguments are not actually these impersonal, rational things. They're very, very personal and context driven, with our emotions at play, with our arbitrary assumptions at play, with our epistemic priors at play, our cultural context, our intuitions, what we grow up with, what we deem to be intuitively plausible. So that's going to be interesting, because why then do our arguments and so many people claim to be completely rational and logical and don't seem to be able to see through this mask? What's actually going on here? We're going to really flesh this out in more detail later. Now, the third thing that we're going to dwell on a little bit in the next video is going to be this historical character of moral arguments and the historical context with which they came pre-packaged. I gave the example of Marx and I gave the example of Aquinas. Go back, listen to that, kind of dwell on that if you need to. Again, another very good resource if you want to learn more about that is going to be a short book called Aquinas by Edward Fazer. He's actually going to articulate Aquinas's ethics and how it really, really depends upon these metaphysical assumptions. So if you're interested in that and what I'm saying there with that historical context, go check that out. With that in mind, I think it's a good place to close. Let's talk next time about pages really 11 through maybe 13-ish, try to get through more of this. I'm going to try to have Chapter 2 finished up within probably 3 more lectures. So for those of you that are still following along, I love to see it. Love to see the enthusiasm. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. And with that, go be prepared, read. Have a good one.